see some of you in those little boxes before we got started, and I'm in no hurry to get off at the end if anyone didn't get a chance to say hello and wants to at that point. It's always a privilege to do any sort of program for Audubon Naturalist Society. As some of you know, my first involvement with Audubon Naturalist Society was in 1977. This is nothing new for me, although I think it's only the second time I've done a Zoom presentation for ANS, did one back in the spring. At any rate, I haven't been studying monarch butterflies quite that long. I got started around 1990, and it's one of the things that brought me to Cape May. Moved up here from the DC area to Cape May 19 years ago after doing some work studying monarch butterflies in Cape Charles, Virginia, and immediately got involved with the monarch work up here that you'll hear about as part of this program. And 5 years ago, the founder of our program, Dick Walton, decided it was time for me to become the director, which means I now get to do the paperwork. At any rate, monarch butterflies are certainly fascinating creatures. I'll be astounded if some of the folks, or if not all of the folks who are here, if you don't know something about monarch butterflies. And indeed, the monarch is one of the most familiar insects anywhere in the United States and southern Canada, and then down into Mexico, where our migratory population ranges. However, non-migratory monarchs do naturally occur throughout tropical America, in Central America and northern South America, and there are actually introduced, probably inadvertently, but introduced populations of monarchs in several other continents. And pretty much everyone will immediately recognize the large orange and black patterned monarch butterfly. I do find every once in a while, though, someone is confused. Oh, I played around with the slides a little bit, so I may slip up like that. The monarch is very frequently used in logos and signs and advertising. It really is a benchmark creature in our natural history. At any rate, the tiger swallowtail is the one butterfly that every once in a while I run into someone who thinks this is a monarch butterfly. Nope, it's not. This is the eastern tiger swallowtail. And this is the funniest thing I used to see for a while. The Scott's Lawn Care Company, and Lord knows what sort of chemicals they're using, had as their logo this very strange hybrid between a monarch butterfly and a tiger swallowtail. I have never seen a butterfly that looks like that. I hope never to, but if I do, it's probably mutated thanks to some agricultural chemicals. But at any rate, the monarch butterfly life cycle is well known to most of us. And like all butterflies and moths and many other forms of insects, it has the 4 different life stages: the egg, the larva, of course known as caterpillar in butterflies and moths, the pupa or transitional stage that in butterflies is known as the chrysalis, and in moths known as the cocoon, and then finally the adult. And for monarch butterflies, the milkweed plants, members of the genus Asclepias, are crucial because those are the plants where the female must lay her eggs. The caterpillars will only feed on milkweed. Now here's an adult that happens to be nectaring on the swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, but the adults will feed on nectar from any flower. I like to say it's the kids who are the picky eaters. So the monarch females will seek out the milkweed patches as places to lay her eggs, and the male monarch butterflies will seek out the milkweed patches in search of the females. The egg is a tiny oblong off-white structure. It has little ridges on it if you look at it up close, and it's typically laid on the underside of a fresh leaf. And a female monarch, depending on her health and various things, can lay 200 to 400 eggs in her lifespan, but she doesn't lay them in a cluster. She lays one here, one there, and typically only one per plant, so that her offspring don't have to compete with one another for the food resource. If you find several eggs or several caterpillars on a milkweed plant, it's likely that more than one female came and visited that plant. From the tiny egg hatches out a tiny little caterpillar. And the caterpillar is not a terribly complex organism. It crawls around and it eats. It has only simple eyes, so it recognizes movement, light and dark. But if you hold the eye chart up to a monarch caterpillar, it's not even going to see the E. And they crawl around and they eat, but they're very good at one thing, and that is growing. Because in the course of about 2 weeks, a monarch butterfly puts on average, about 3,100 times its initial weight. That's a pretty remarkable thing when you think about it. If a human grew at the same rate of growth, your 8-pound baby after 2 weeks would weigh as much as 2 full-grown elephants. So we kind of take that rate of growth for granted, but I think it's something to certainly be impressed about and to admire how efficient the growth of a caterpillar is. Now, after about 2 weeks in the caterpillar stage and after 4 molts with 5 different caterpillar life stages separated by molts, each one of those life stages is known as an instar. When the 5th molt is approaching, the caterpillar will weave a little silken button on an overhanging spot, will attach its tail end to that, and will hang in this curled shape that we, for obvious reasons, call the J, and will hang as a J, slowly getting more and more limp for about a day and a half. And then, as our friend Nate Irwin used to always say, he'd be sitting there with the camera set up, and just when he'd have to run away for a minute, the transition would occur, because it happens very, very quickly, where that last caterpillar skin splits off the structure, the animal wiggles until that shed skin coils up at the top and drops off. And what's underneath is this seemingly strange green sac that over the course of about half of a day dries up and forms this beautiful hard casing, a dark green with gold and black speckles on it, really a beautiful structure. And inside this chrysalis, the amazing metamorphosis occurs, the transformation from the caterpillar to the adult butterfly. And you can see this photo is near the end of that transition, because the wing of the butterfly is just barely visible through there. The wings grow, compound eyes grow, the chewing mouth disappears, and the long proboscis, or coiled drinking straw mouth part of the adult develops. The legs grow long, the jointed legs, just all sorts of amazing transformations. The gametes are formed. It's really remarkable. It's a friend of mine said it's like you crawl in a sleeping bag and go to sleep for 2 weeks, and when you open it up, you're a dolphin or something, completely different. Metamorphosis is something we all learn about as a kid. We take it for granted often as adults, but to me, it will never stop being a miraculous biological transformation that takes place in all butterflies and moths, and certainly some other insects as well that undergo complete metamorphosis.
Mark, we have a question.
Yes.
Do the golden black dots on the chrysalis have a function?
To the best of our knowledge, the row, I'm going to go back there, the row up at the top, nobody has figured out a function of those, but it's thought that the lower speckles, the gold speckles that are just on the lower part of the chrysalis, someone has determined that that is where spiracles develop, which are the breathing tubes in the abdomen of the adult butterfly. Now, exactly how that works, I don't know, but that's what I have recently read, and I don't know if that's proven or still hypothesis.
Thank you. That's all for now.
Sure. All right. So once the butterfly is pretty much fully developed on the inside. That green color disappears, the outer casing of the chrysalis becomes clear. And this is another stage. The butterfly can be like this for a full day. You're watching and watching, you want to see it come out, and the emergence takes maybe half a minute. But what comes out is a butterfly with a really fat abdomen, small, wet, crinkled wings. And in those wings are little tubes, which the fluid from the abdomen is pumped through in the first half hour or so of the adult stage of the animal's life. And it also aligns itself so that gravity helps pull the wings down into their normal position. After about 30 to 60 minutes, the fluid starts to harden and dry. Those tubes are known as veins, but that's misleading because there's no living cells in the wing at this point. The fluid pumps out into those tubes, but it never returns. But finally, we end up with the adult butterfly, which may stay put for a few more hours, fully drying before it will then begin to fly. And here is one of just the very few videos I've put in because I know they're fairly jerky. But the first thing that this butterfly is likely to do once it is dried and able to fly is to seek out food. And here it's probing the flowers of seaside goldenrod with that long proboscis, its mouth part, with which it drinks the nectar. Caterpillars eat, butterflies drink. Now, at this point, we can tell the difference between the males and the females. The males have these two raised scent glands, or really scent packets is a better word, because these are also not living cells, but they're packed with pheromones that are on a specific dark line on each hind wing of the butterfly. And it releases those pheromones by tipping the claspers at the end of the abdomen into those little pouches to release the pheromone. The males also have very thin lines on the upper surface of the wing. And we compare that to the female, you'll see the lack of the scent glands and the very thick dark lines on the upper wing. Once you've been around monarchs a while, it's easy to identify a female even as she's just flying away because she's overall darker. And once you've got the male and the female that have both emerged, courtship begins. Usually it's going to be 2 or 3 days before the female is ready to mate, but you know, he's going to be more anxious. But really within the first few days, mating will occur. And in monarchs, as in other butterflies, it's tip of abdomen to tip of abdomen. And he has structures called claspers at the end of his abdomen that he will grab onto the female. And they may stay linked like this for several hours in mating. And then, of course, seeking out the milkweed again, laying the eggs, the caterpillar grows, the cycle, it repeats itself. And the time of development from egg to adult is really only about a month. It happens quite quickly, about 3 or 4 days for the egg to hatch, 10 to 14 days in the larval stage, 10 to 14 days in the pupa stage, and then about 3 days until successful mating and breeding and then egg laying. So that means you can have a generation every month. When the weather gets cooler, as a cold-blooded creature, the life stages may progress a little more slowly. But this is the average, and indeed, the monarch will have several generations passing every summer. But summer is going to give way to winter eventually. And most of the butterflies that we will see in the mid-Atlantic region have some physiological adaptation to survive the prolonged freezing temperatures of winter. In some, it's in the egg stage. In many, it's as small second or third instar caterpillars finding sheltered places in a leaf litter or other sheltered spots out in the environment. Some, the swallowtail butterflies in particular, actually overwinter in the chrysalis stage. And there are a few, most notably in the DC area, the mourning cloak, the eastern comma, and the question mark, that actually overwinter as dormant adults. And they're all able to withstand prolonged period of freezing weather. Not 100%, but enough of them survive to bring about the next year's generation. Monarchs have no such adaptation. You can really consider them a tropical species because that's the definition of a tropical species: no ability to survive the prolonged freezes of winter. But it brings up the question, why do they leave the tropics? And as we mentioned earlier, they don't all leave the tropics, but the populations of monarchs that exist in Central America, Northern South America are very small, because in those megadiverse environments, the amount of milkweed is pretty minimal. And that is the crucial thing that's necessary for monarchs. And milkweed historically has abounded in many parts of the United States and Southern Canada, particularly in the prairie environment, but also in clearings and openings in the forested areas, such as here in the mid-Atlantic. And over time, monarchs evolved this migratory pattern where many of them will leave the tropics for the spring, summer, fall seasons of North America in the temperate zone, and several generations will pass. Typically, it's 4 generations a year. The first generation hatching out from eggs and then going through metamorphosis in April and May. So you've got adults emerging in May, another generation in June, another in July, another in August. But something in late summer triggers the monarchs that emerge, and in our area, it's after about mid-August, to be completely different in their behavior from the previous ones, which again, 2 or 3 days into their adult stage are looking to mate. And this generation has their urge to mate subdued. It's what's called reproductive diapause. And instead of behaving like their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, instead they undertake this really epic transcontinental migration, heading down to the mountains west of Mexico City, where they cluster by the millions high in those mountains to wait out the northern winter. And they go high in the mountains because a normal lifespan for an adult active monarch butterfly that's courting and breeding and behaving territorially and traveling around is about 2 months. And the northern winter is longer than that. So high in the mountains, they find what I call nature's refrigerator, an area where it is cool but not freezing. And they cluster together where they can conserve some of the heat with thousands of bodies packed closely together to survive the occasional freezing spell that might occur. And arriving usually around the beginning of November and staying until March in the wintering areas in Mexico, living the equivalent of 3 or 4 lifespans by going into this period of dormancy. And there's sometimes an early and or a late generation. So the 4 generations is not an absolute. Sometimes there are 5 generations. And somehow these butterflies are going to find their way from, say, Woodend, where one of the monarchs might have emerged in August, find their way roughly 2,000 miles away to the mountains of Mexico, and getting back into essentially the same forest, sometimes, within a few hundred yards of where their great grandparents may have gone the year before. All of this incredible migration by an animal that weighs a half a gram, that has a brain the size of a poppy seed, but somewhere in there is a map to Mexico. It's really a remarkable thing. And Fred Urquhart was we got a question?
Sorry, yes, we got a couple questions. So could you speak about what we can do during the winter months to help monarchs?
We'll sort of get to that a little bit later, but really what we can do in the winter months involves working towards protection of the areas where they're wintering in Mexico. And when we can travel again, traveling down there is a great thing to do because ecotourism dollars have really helped support conservation efforts there. And then prepare for the following year by planting a butterfly garden with milkweed for the caterpillars and nectar plants for the adults. So we can't plant our garden in the winter, but we can start planting it.
Awesome. And according to the slide, monarchs stop in the south on the way north, but skip the south on the way to Mexico. Do you know why?
Well, the monarchs that are coming north, and we're gonna see some maps later on in the program. They're breaking dormancy generally in early to mid-March and arriving in the southern tier of the United States in early April, and just barely into the temperate zone there, even a little bit of northern Mexico. And at those latitudes, the milkweeds that grow there, milkweeds are perennial plants. They die back for the winter and then grow again in the spring, with the exception of the tropical milkweed, which occurs in the tropical areas. But the migratory monarchs are taking advantage of the temperate milkweeds that are perennials. And in the southern tier of the United States, the milkweed is just starting to sprout in April. Nice tender young leaves, and that's where the reproduction occurs. The milkweed at our latitudes isn't sprouting until early or mid-May. And so it's the second generation, not the ones that spent the winter in Mexico, but their offspring that will then be able to breed up here. Now, they don't automatically die after they've bred. It seems amazing that a monarch that may have been an egg as early as late July, that then went through its metamorphosis, migrated to Mexico, went through 5 months of dormancy, came back, reproduced, laid its eggs in, say, Texas, it doesn't automatically die. Most to at that point, but all they know to do is to keep coming north. And most years in April, I will see one or a few very pale, tattered monarch butterflies here in the mid-Atlantic. And those are ones that have come all the way back from Mexico. They better have bred to the south because the milkweed's not up here yet, but it's really miraculous to see one of those. But once they start south, it's no breeding, wherever they may be, from whether they're in Georgia or in Nova Scotia, North Dakota, Minnesota, Alberta, southeastern Alberta, Oklahoma, this huge area of North America. And it seems there's evidence now that the Q is at whatever latitude they are, once the sun never reaches 57 degrees above the horizon, as the days are shortening, that seems to be the trigger for them to start south. That's a long answer to a short question, I know.
Thank you so much. There is a last question about if you have been to Mexico, but I know that you're gonna show us an amazing video.
Yes, I have been to Mexico twice, and that's coming. But before we get to that, I want to talk about Dr. Fred Urquhart, who was a Canadian scientist who, like many in the early and mid 20th century, saw lots of monarchs flying south across southern Ontario, where he was working, and in many, many parts of the United States in September and October. So many of them flying south that you can't help but notice it if you're a naturalist, and even John Q. Public sometimes would notice. And it was one of the great mysteries of the 20th century, because while kept seeing all these monarchs going south. For the longest time, nobody knew where they were going. And Dr. Urquhart started the first tagging programs in the middle of the 20th century, and got some results in finding monarchs moving from Ontario down into the southern United States, and then people in Mexico were seeing them, but nobody could find where they were going. And eventually he, in the early 1970s, he put ads in the newspapers in Mexico City looking for people who would volunteer to go out and search and try and find where the monarchs are going. And as some of you may remember, the big was on the 2nd of January in 1975 and showed up in August 76, National Geographic, when Catalina Aguado and Kenneth Brugger succeeded in finding the first of the overwintering colonies of monarchs in Mexico, an astounding discovery. We'll get back to that. So Dr. Urquhart was a key scientist of monarch study in the 20th century. And here's a map I was referring to of looking at the migration of monarch butterflies. The northern extent of their range is the northern extent of milkweed. So you see it does go all the way across southern Canada. The soggy Pacific Northwest doesn't have milkweed, but the spring on this map is showing where the breeding is typically occurring of the first ones coming back, and then the subsequent generations moving around. If you read monarch literature from 20, 25 years ago, it would say the crest of the Rocky Mountains, the Front Range, is an absolute barrier, that all monarchs west of there went to California and all the ones east of there went to Mexico. But Dr. Robert Michael Pyle, who's a good friend of ANS, did some studies, and some other folks in Arizona have subsequently done studies to discover that some of the monarchs west of the Rockies are going to Mexico as well. And exactly why some are going that way and some to California, we don't know yet. But this is showing a little bit of the map. All those question marks in Mexico is, we don't know if there's other areas. And notice there is a non-migratory population in South Florida, in subtropical South Florida. We're gonna come back to that as well. Now, from the upper Midwest, and if you're in Minnesota or northern Wisconsin, a monarch butterfly has about 2,000 miles to go to get to the overwintering areas that are west of Mexico City. And it's a straightforward trip down. But if you're a monarch way up in the Northeast, say in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, Canada, it's a trickier trip. And we're switching to a different map here. If you just follow your instincts and fly south as a monarch up there, this one I've randomly picked by the Maine-New Brunswick border, you're in danger, because a monarch is not going to fly for days over the ocean. So they instead are going to trend a little to the west to stay over land. Now, the cold fronts that we've been getting some nice ones this fall, and the prevailing autumn winds are west or northwest. And a little monarch butterfly doesn't want to fight strong winds. So as the monarch is coming down out of New England, it's going to probably stay fairly close to the coast as opposed to fighting these winds. And that's going to bring a lot of monarchs into the mid-Atlantic region, and especially the mid-Atlantic coastal regions. At the same time, there are monarchs from the Eastern Great Lakes region that may just ride those northwesterly winds and also head towards the mid-Atlantic. And you put those two lines together and you've got a great big funnel. And a lot of those monarchs, under the right weather conditions from a huge area in the Northeast, are going to end up along the Atlantic coast, and specifically here in New Jersey, where I live, because the coastline goes from trending northeast to southwest to running pretty much north-south in New Jersey. And once they end up in New Jersey, they are funneled down here to this little peninsula known as Cape May, which is where I'm speaking to you from. And it's the same phenomenon that makes Cape May and the Atlantic coast a great place for migratory birds that are often found in really huge concentrations here, like this northern parula. And dragonflies. There are a lot of dragonflies that migrate, and we don't know a lot about why they're migrating or where they're going, but some like this Halloween pennant are at times ridiculously common on parts of the Atlantic coast, like Cape May and some other spots we'll talk about a little later. And indeed, the monarchs in Cape May are a big tourist attraction. We have a lot of people that come here hoping to see an aggregation of hundreds or thousands of monarch butterflies. And under the right conditions, and we've had a lot of the right conditions over the last 2 weeks, we've been seeing lots and lots of monarchs here in Cape May as the northwest winds have been blowing and causing that funneling effect to bring lots and lots of monarchs here. And from Cape May over to Delaware is about 12 miles of open water, and a lot of monarchs will stop to rest and refuel here before attempting that long water crossing. I like to make the comparison. If you had to go out and run or hike at a brisk pace for 12 miles, and if you stopped once along the way, you died, you would make sure you were well rested and well nourished before you began. And so too do these monarch butterflies gather like that. These roosting clusters are one of the things we're always eager to see. When the weather's a little bit chilly at night, the monarchs really do tend to gather together, and you'll see one flying by and it will see this cluster of monarchs and say, I'm going to join them. And it's partly, conserving heat, but it may be just some instinct, because this is what they're going to do in Mexico, but just, 10,000 times as many as we're seeing here in Cape May. By the way, these roosting clusters are not unique to the Atlantic coast. You can sometimes see them right in the Piedmont of Maryland and Virginia near DC, and right across into the Great Plains, especially when you've got some good habitat surrounded by a lack of habitat. You'll get the monarchs clustering in areas like that. And it's special to find these groupings. Anyway, these monarchs have come down from, say, New Brunswick, Canada, and they're now at Cape May, and they've got to figure out how to get to Mexico from here. And in fact, after the monarch wintering areas in Mexico were first discovered by Western scientists, the villagers knew, but Western scientists discovered in 1975, there were Midwestern biologists who doubted that monarchs along the East Coast could make it successfully to Mexico. So that brings us to Dick Walton, a wonderful naturalist from Concord, Massachusetts, who came to Cape May several times in the early 1980s for reasons that many naturalists come to Cape May. He's a bird watcher, came to see the birds here, and he was amazed by the monarchs that he saw on some of his visits. And he started talking to residents around Cape May saying, somebody should study these, somebody should study them. And everyone, yeah, somebody should. And finally, in 1990, Dick founded the Cape May Monarch Monitoring Project, which later affiliated with New Jersey Audubon Society. And to try and develop good protocol, he contacted Dr. Lincoln Brower, who was at that point considered the world's preeminent monarch biologist. He's shown here in the mountains of Mexico. And Dr. Brower passed away just 2 years ago, but was very involved with monarch studies throughout the country, right throughout his life, and very active in monarch conservation. And Dr. Brower, as an aside here, he became famous to the general public when he was looking at the question of why are monarchs orange. And this is the part of the Scientific American magazine cover work he did of proving that monarchs were toxic and distasteful to vertebrates. They sequester in their bodies chemicals from the milkweed plants they feed on as caterpillars called cardiac glycosides that are heart poisons, but they're also powerful emetics. And forgive me for the next photo, but this is what happens when a blue jay raised in the laboratory, naively taking food from the graduate students every day, is fed a monarch butterfly. It eats it and then it promptly gets sick. And this was the landmark experiment that Brower did that made him famous. And it's kind of interesting because we think a lot of birds, and the toxins affect mammals and reptiles, amphibians as well. We think a lot of them have a natural aversion to the orange and black coloration, but some of them are going to have to test. And this is our little falcon called a merlin that migrates in good numbers along the Atlantic coast here. And merlins are feisty things. They go after everything. And I'm sorry the picture isn't sharper, but one day I was watching a merlin fly here in Cape May, and it swooped down. It saw something flying and it grabbed a monarch butterfly. And it looked down and saw what it had in its talons. It let that monarch go. And I watched the butterfly fly away after having been in the talons of a merlin. And in tagging monarchs, I've several times, and twice this year already, found a monarch that had this talon-sized hole pierced through a wing. The monarch can still fly. It survives that. Whether they had to learn the lesson like that blue jay did, or they had natural aversion, this is some of the landmark studies that Lincoln Brower did to gain his fame. And by the way, those toxins do not affect invertebrates. So monarchs can be fed on by mantids, spiders, assassin bugs, other invertebrates. Anyway, Brower worked with Dick Walton and developed, after a couple of years of testing, something called the road census. And since 1992, every day in September and October, 3 times a day for the first 3 quarters of that time period, and as the days shorten, twice a day, a researcher does a slow drive along a designated route through Cape May and Cape May Point, and they drive it at about, gotta start that again, drive it at about 20 miles an hour and count every monarch they see along the route. And that gets calculated into monarchs seen per hour. And it's not going to tell us how many butterflies are here altogether, but it's a probability of encounter. It's a censusing technique modified from something originally developed in the 19th century called a Pollard walk. And it gives us thousands upon thousands of data points to compare the numbers of monarchs around Cape May from one year to another. So that's one part of our study here. We tried that when I started a monarch project down at Cape Charles, Virginia in the mid-90s, and down there it switched to a point count for their census. The next part of the study was tagging, and originally done by Urquhart in the mid-20th century. Now hundreds and hundreds of people volunteer to tag monarch butterflies, and there are little adhesive stickers that go on the wing. These are the tags that what they looked like for many years, with an email address and a toll-free number. Last year, they switched to new tags with just a website where you go to report the information if you find a tagged monarch. But the key is the last line, a unique code. It's now 4 letters and 3 numbers, never repeated. And if you ever see a tagged monarch butterfly, if you get a nice digital photo and can blow it up on your computer, you can report that code number at the website mwtag.org and help science. Most a significant amount of tagging is done, like here, Cape Charles, Chincoteague, other spots. We keep some other data points as well. And this is an old map. This is now about 5 years old. We have a lot more monarchs that should go on there, but this is where monarchs that have been tagged in Cape May have been found. And there's now 91 that have been found in Mexico. That may not seem like a lot, but most that are going to bear a tag, nobody's ever going to see again. And we see that the pattern of the migration is pretty much east of the Appalachian Mountains along the Gulf Coast. We've got several new recoveries in Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas now. But curiously, there are a few that on north. We think those might have been tagged at the beginning of September and were actually the last pre-migratory generation. Two in the Bahamas, we think were just blown off course, and a little cluster in peninsular Florida. We don't know if some of them intend to go to peninsular Florida and mix with that non-migratory population or not. We have had one tagged in Cape May, a female, that was found in November laying eggs in Florida. So that's curious, but we know many of them are indeed going to Mexico and making it. And here's our speed record. As far as I know, this is the fastest a monarch has ever been known to travel. In 3 days and 28 minutes, it made it from Cape May Point to the little town of Harlem, Georgia, 558 miles in a straight line in 3 days. People go, oh, it had a tailwind. Well, yeah, they use a wind in their favor still. And that's right along the migratory pathway we'd expect them to be following. Now, I mentioned that we've been studying them here in Cape May. Denise Gibbs started a project many years ago in Chincoteague at the Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge, primarily the south end of Assateague Island. In 1995, I started a project down at Cape Charles, Virginia, that is now run by the nonprofit organization called the Coastal Virginia Wildlife Observatory down there. And all three of these locations have done a lot of tagging of monarch butterflies, Cape Charles and Cape May doing censusing. There's also one individual, her name is Gail Steffi, who works out of the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area. And she does a lot of tagging there. And she did an analysis of tagging recoveries and found that a lot higher percentage of monarchs tagged inland in the mid-Atlantic were successfully making it to Mexico compared to the coastal route. And it shows what we have suspected, that these big water crossings, like the mouth of Delaware Bay, the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, are hazardous to monarchs. But if you compare Gail's work with, say, tagging studies in Minnesota, as we alluded to a while ago, those from the upper Midwest, and both of these places are about 2,000 miles from Mexico. There's an even higher percentage coming from the Midwest. So the coastal route is more difficult, but it is at least successful for some migratory monarchs. Now, in addition to the census and the tagging, educational outreach is a big part of our program here in Cape May. And we are able to hire 2 young seasonal naturalists each fall to work with us. And we like to brag on where they have all ended up in their careers. And then one thing, unfortunately, we can't do in the time of COVID is have these big tagging demos and let the tag monarchs go off the hands of some of our audience, because it is just really special to see a kid light up when this little butterfly is set on their hand and then takes off to continue its migration. Oh, and you don't have to be a kid to marvel at that. And off it goes. So we're going to go to Mexico now, and we're going to talk about where the monarchs are going. You see in the little map on the right where in Mexico this enlarged area is. And as the big map shows, way on the right edge below the key, that's where Mexico City is located. This is a mountain range known as the Transvolcanic Mountain Range. It is forested mountains getting up 12,000 feet in elevation. And each of the butterfly symbols is an area where monarchs are known to cluster in the overwintering colonies. And the whole region is set aside as a reserve by the Mexican government, is recognized by the United Nations as a biosphere reserve. Doesn't mean there's not still some illegal logging done and some habitat degradation, but efforts are out there to protect these areas. And there are more areas than are shown on this map. There are 4 of them that are open to public visitation. And I've been to 3. I'm going to show you a little bit of what it's like at Sierra Cinque, at El Rosario, and at Cerro Pelon. And the other site that I haven't visited but is open to the public is Piedra Errada. And one of the things when you visit the Monarchs, you have to pay an admission and you work with a local guide. And this is Estela Romero. If any of you are real Monarch fans, you may follow the postings on a website called Journey North that tracks migrations. And Estela is the correspondent from Mexico that reports to Journey North. Wonderful, wonderful naturalist. We were very fortunate to be able to travel with Estela when I was there nearly 3 years ago in February of 2018. And the Sierra Cinque and El Rosario sanctuaries are fairly close to one another. In each case, the funding from various international conservation groups, especially the Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund, have built these very nice entry booths and visitor centers. And additionally, they've put up all of these vendor booths so that when you visit the Monarch Reserve on your way out, they're hoping you're going to spend a little more money in the local community. And there are restaurants and gift shops and crafts and all sorts of wonderful things you can purchase. Now, 2 years ago at Sierra Cinque, we went on a Sunday, and Sunday is a day that the Mexicans love to get out and explore. There was a bicycling group of Mexicans from Mexico City that had come out. I don't think they biked all the way from Mexico City, but they were up at Sierra Cinque this day. And most of the other visitors were Mexicans this day. It was fun. There's international tourism, but it's nice to see that the locals also appreciate the phenomenon. And at Sierra Cinque, you've got your choice, like at all of the reserves, of going on foot, which is the left of the fence, or hiring for about 15 or 20 bucks a horse to take you up. And you don't have to know anything about riding a horse. The handler will actually walk in front of the horse, holding the reins at a very, very slow and steady pace. And it's about, depending on where the Monarchs are, 1.5 miles, 2 miles generally to get back to where the reserves are. On the way, just these fabulous mountain views. And when you come around the corner, there will be staff there, guides, telling everyone to be super quiet, limiting how close you can get. And there they are, trees just loaded with monarch butterflies. It was late February when we went. They were starting to break dormancy. It was a sunny day, so a lot of them spread their wings. And as I say, most of the visitors were Mexican, and this little Mexican boy was absolutely delighted when the monarch came down and landed on him. And he was just so delighted. It was very fun to watch. And he was happy to have his picture taken. El Rosario is the most heavily visited of the reserves, often the one with the most monarch butterflies and with the most elaborate development for visitors, with the entry arch and the big stone and glass visitor center. It's really impressive. By the way, the admission fees are very reasonable to go to these places. And here again, you're with a local guide. The trail is very, very nice at El Rosario. Took me a while to get up because there were good birds along the way, red warblers and white-eared hummingbirds and a number of other interesting birds on the way. And I was impressed at El Rosario that there was very, very excellent interpretive signage, and it was in Spanish. It wasn't for the tourists. It was from out of the country. It was really designed to help educate the Mexican visitors themselves so that they would better appreciate the monarch biology. And after walking a while, we came to this little meadow, and monarchs, they will break dormancy about once every 2 or 3 weeks all winter long to take in water. They don't need to eat all winter long, but they do take water. And a monarch gets water by taking drops of dew off the grass. So we found all these monarchs down in the grass, others in the shrubs. I said, all right, we've really made it. Well, Estela said to me, no. This is just the appetizer course. But it was amazing to see all the butterflies down on the ground, sipping the dew. end of the dormant period, some of the wildflowers were starting to bloom, and some were starting to feed after fasting for 4 or 5 months to prepare for their journey back north. But we went a little bit further, and here we started seeing the big numbers of monarchs. Here, not drinking off of dew, but a little shallow puddle that had formed from a recent rain. And we had a few other visitors around, all of us completely enthralled with the number of monarch butterflies. And it was a sunny day, again, close to the time for them to head north, and many of them took flight in the middle of the day. I'll apologize, I know videos don't do well over Zoom, but we're gonna just show you, you'll get a sense of all the monarchs that were flying around, and imagine what it's like to be in the midst of a cloud of monarchs like this. Just a sky full of butterflies. And in the bottom, you see the trees are still loaded with monarchs. It's estimated that historically, in the very peak years, upwards of 1 billion monarchs could be found in the Mexican reserves. Even in the very lowest years now, it's thought to be at least 50 million. And at certain times, it was just hard to fathom what we were really experiencing. And a little further along to the left was another grassy field with dew, and it was absolutely loaded with monarchs. Here, I think this is going to be my last video to torture you with, but the monarchs just swirling around and dropping down to drink the dew off the grass. So El Rosario did not disappoint. The third sanctuary we visited, which is the least frequently visited and the least heavily developed, you see just the hand-made signs, is Cerro Pelon. And there's something to be said about it. Now, we arrived at Cerro Pelon and were surprised at the very nice entry booth area and the beautiful covered picnic shelters. Again, World Wildlife Fund did this to encourage the Mexican families, which love to take the extended family out for Sunday picnics, to come up here. But it was a Tuesday. It was pretty much empty when we were there. Here we had another local guide, a young man named David, who took us up. And it's a rougher trail. It's a little longer ways up. So here you're really encouraged to go by horseback rather than hike. I've been there twice. I hiked the first time. Yeah, the second time I rode the horse. And when you get close, you know, because the little handwritten signs are there, and you come around the corner and there again, trees just loaded with monarch butterflies. Not as many flying around on a cloudy day. And sadly, even in the ideal conditions, 10 or 20% of the monarchs that make it to Mexico don't make it back. They don't have adequate food reserves, or something disturbs them. And ironically, most tagged monarchs that are found in Mexico are found from wings that are down on the ground. But even if some of them don't survive, many of them do. And as I say, how in the world would you find every tagged monarch when they're clustering like this? You really don't. Oh, I lied. I have one more video here of the monarchs swirling around at Cerro Pelon. And it's fun to visit this area. This is Mangangueo, which is the closest town to El Rosario and Sierra Cinque. Mural in town features the monarchs and the old folkloric story that the monarchs are spewed out by the sun every fall. And you notice at the bottom, the cherubs holding up the sign with monarch wings. Monarchs are everywhere. They see murals on the side of buildings. This one painted on the side of a bridge. Even the taco stands using the monarch motif. And in the state of Michoacan, the tourism office uses the monarch as their logo. No surprise there. And for a while, it was on the license plate too. I'm not a Jeopardy watcher, but a bunch of friends of mine told me a couple nights ago this was the answer to Final Jeopardy, that it was monarch butterflies on the license plate for Michoacan. So how are the monarchs doing? This is what we'll wrap up with, a little of this in conservation. As is well known, the overwintering population in Mexico, while fluctuating from year to year, has really been in a decline. How is this population determined? Surveyors in there to carefully measure how much land area is covered by the monarch-filled trees. One of the big problems that most conservation biologists think is causing the decline of monarchs has to do with the changing farm practices in the Midwest. Before the Great Plains were farms, they were prairies, and there was a lot of milkweed there. And for years and years, the farms would still have a lot of weeds growing up along the edges, which would include a lot of milkweed. Farmers, small farmers, were very proud of the entrance road. They'd have a lot of plantings along the way into the farm. But starting about 25 years ago, more and more farms were consolidated into big corporate farms, and genetically modified crops were developed that were resistant to herbicide, which allowed the old crop dusters to come over the cornfield, spray herbicide, and not allow a speck of weed to grow in with those fields. And it's thought that so much milkweed was lost this way that it's caused a great decline in the monarch butterflies. There's thoughts that drought and land use in the southern US has caused less nectar to fuel the migrants as well. This is a chart. The blue line shows the monarch overwintering population, and the green shows the amount of glyphosate, the herbicide, the active ingredient of Roundup, used by the American agricultural industry. It's compelling evidence. And here is showing that most of the monarchs, the first new generation of the year, are heading up into the farm belt. And that's the lower map. And the upper map, the darker the color, the more glyphosate is used by the agricultural industry. Now, for almost 30 years now, we've also conducted these censuses in Cape May. And while the numbers fluctuate, our numbers have stayed much more stable. Now, that's really telling. Why are monarch populations doing better here? Well, the farm belt migrants aren't coming here. So that maybe leads some extra credence to the theory that it's these farm practices that are causing the big problems. And in the Northeast, butterfly gardens are widespread. So people have stepped in where habitat has been lost and are helping the monarch butterflies. Here we see that funnel area. You don't have the big corporate farms for the most part where the East Coast monarchs are coming from. And to have a butterfly garden, you don't even need much space. You need milkweed plants for the caterpillars, and you need flowering plants that provide a nectar source for the adult butterflies. Here it's a native tall woodland sunflower, but they'll come to garden plants as well, a marigold here. And if you have these nectar producing flowers in your garden, you're gonna probably see monarchs, especially fall blooming ones that will provide nectar for the migrating monarchs. And here is our coastal environment here at Cape May. The dune field used to extend in a good half mile, and it would have been loaded with this seaside goldenrod that the monarchs like. Those dunes are gone, there's houses instead, but where there's butterfly gardens, the monarchs can still make it through. So if you want to help monarch butterflies, and this goes back to the question we had before, what are some things you can do? You can plant a butterfly garden, and you can even just have a milkweed plant in a pot on a balcony in an apartment. You can encourage legislators to, at the local, state, and federal level, to protect pollinators and habitat. You can support conservation groups that are working to protect monarchs. You can visit the Mexican monarch reserves. Sadly, the ANS trip that was planned for February of this year got canceled due to some concerns over a couple of violent incidents that turned out to be isolated, but at the time we didn't know. But hopefully when this pandemic is done and we can travel again, we'll have a group from ANS visiting the monarch reserves in Mexico, because the ecotourism dollars are really helping down there. And you can buy organic produce, which is not going to have been produced using all those herbicides. So I've got 8:02. That means I've run a couple minutes over, but I just thank you all for following along on this story of the monarch butterflies and their journey to Mexico, their multi-generational intercontinental migratory cycle. I love just saying that. And now if there are questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mark. And as it is customary, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to either continue using the chat box or unmute yourselves to ask them. While you were presenting, there was a question about the trips that you lead in Cape May. Can you talk a little bit about what did you use to do pre-COVID?
Yeah, I was probably 4 or 5 times a year for ANS leading a 2 or 3 day field trip up here to Cape May. Cape May is a pretty remarkable natural history destination for the birds and the butterflies. So our autumn programs would always include a little bit on the monarch butterflies, and I would tag a few for the group. I don't know if you guys are still using the phrase that I came up with when I was working there full time in the 90s that I called the Natural Heritage Series. But my field trips, while we may have more attention on birds or butterflies or something, I always try and do field trips where we look at the whole ecosystem, talk a little bit about the geography and the landscape and the climate, how that affects the plant communities and how that affects the wildlife. And at each season, there were different highlights. So some of our dead of winter trips were a little less than fully comfortable, but there's always something to see here in Cape May. And I'm eager to get to the point where we can start doing those field trips again, because usually those field trips are about 3/4 people that are longtime friends from my time at ANS, and always a few folks I'm getting to meet for the first time, which is really fun.
Awesome. We have a question. Are monarch butterflies toxic to adults?
Yeah, once the caterpillar is in about its 3rd stage, it's incorporated enough of the cardiac glycosides that it will be toxic to any vertebrate. Now, if you're talking about an adult human, the big caterpillars or the chrysalids actually, or the adult butterfly, they are powerful emetics, and they typically will make the potential predator get sick before actually harming them. But if you could stomach enough, all right, I'm seeing, I guess I did answer that question. If only toxic when they are adults. No, once they're about the 3rd stage of the caterpillar, they have incorporated enough of the cardiac glycosides that they're also toxic. But the first 2 stages, when they're really small caterpillars, they're not toxic, and they are fed on a lot by birds.
Thank you. Is it better to raise monarchs inside or outside of a bug tent?
You know, there's been some recent work that's showing that some people thought they could save them, help the monarchs by raising hundreds of them, either inside or in a monarch tent, or an outdoor tent. And it's generally better to let nature take its course. Raising a few inside to watch them metamorphosis is a spectacular activity for kids and school kids, but raising them inside, it's really important to have them near a window where they are going to have the natural daylight cycle. Because it's thought that if they're in an interior room or curtains are down and they're not going to have the normal day length, that they're not going to behave properly as adults and may not navigate properly. It may seem fine when you let them go, but So if you want to raise them inside, make sure it's right by a window where they're going to have the natural day length. Same outside. But raising hundreds of monarchs is not advisable. There's some evidence that enables diseases or weak monarchs to be out there that, in nature shouldn't be surviving. So don't go try and raise 500 monarchs to help the population, which ought to be 1 billion. You're not going to make a significant difference anyway. But if you can raise 5 or 10 to just enjoy and educate and be blown away by the magic of metamorphosis, then that's a great thing to be doing.
Have you ever seen the monarchs in Santa Cruz, California, near natural bridges in the winter?
There are a number of spots on the California coast where monarchs will overwinter. Santa Cruz is a well-known area. Pacific Grove up by Monterey is well-known, but they do extend all the way down to Los Angeles in small clusters. I've never seen one of the really big ones in California. I've never made that trek, but we did see a small roost near Los Angeles a few years ago. Yeah, I know in Pacific Grove, the monarch is the whole town's logo and personality, and they have a big parade with the kids and all of that. And it would be fun to get there sometime as well.
Great. That is all that we had in the chat. Oh, Kim just asked a question. What are 2 or 3 plants for Mid-Atlantic area available in commercial nurseries that you would suggest for both caterpillar and butterfly stages?
Well, in caterpillar, it's got to be one of the milkweeds, and there's 3 species of milkweed that are really widespread naturally around here. Now, the common milkweed, I don't know that I've ever seen that in a garden center, but it's pretty easy to grow and pretty widespread. And you can get seeds for that, especially through some monarch conservation groups. Swamp milkweed, there are several cultivars of that are really beautiful, and that's Asclepias incarnata, and widespread in garden centers. Just make sure you're not going to a garden center that's treating plants with neonicotinoids, as we're slowly getting rid of that, but that may still be in use at some garden centers. The third is sometimes called butterfly weed or orange milkweed. It does really well in dry, open, sunny conditions, and that is also available in some garden centers. In terms of nectar plants, native plants that are generally available in garden centers and that especially will continue to bloom late in the season, things like purple coneflower, the echinacea, Joe Pye weed, and boneset, the various eupatoriums. Those are good ones. Mexican sunflower or Tithonia is another good one. But really, even the non-native things, zinnias, monarchs love zinnias at this time of year.
So evolution would typically lead to wise predators visiting these mountains around the same time of the year. Has that happened?
Oh, boy, that's a fascinating thing. I often start my talks about monarchs saying, I hope you've got 6 hours, because I've got at least 6 hours of stuff I'd like to talk about. There are 2 species of birds and 1 mammal, a little form of mouse, that have figured out how they can take advantage of some monarchs. I don't know much about the mouse and how it's able to do that, but it will only get to monarchs that end up on the ground. But there's a form of the black-headed grosbeak that basically has figured out it can eat some monarchs once, like every 10 days. And whether it also finds some other food in the intervening days that counteracts the toxins, or just has an iron stomach and figures out that has somehow figured out that it will only feed on them every so often is an amazing thing. And then even more incredible is the black-backed oriole, which will dissect the body of an adult monarch butterfly and knows which parts have the toxin sequestered and eats only the other parts. As makes sense ecologically from the question, if there is a mass potential food resource out there, something's going to figure out how to take advantage of it. It's thought that may be one of the reasons, one of the advantages the monarchs have in clustering together in such large numbers, is there just can't be enough birds surviving the 8 months or 7 months of the year when monarchs aren't there to totally devastate the colonies for the 4 or 5 months that they are.
Thank you so much, Mark. That is, I hope, everything that we had in the chat box. A reminder to everyone that if you want to ask a question, go ahead.
I actually see another one in here. It says, you may plant as many milkweeds as you like, but monarch most likely will not come to lay eggs. They only go to places they're familiar with. If you're within the range of milkweed, which is most of the United States and southern Canada, the evidence is that that's not true, that the monarchs in those, I tend to call them non-migratory generations, but they're really moving around. I mean, the first new generation of the year may go from Texas to Ontario, and that they are basically dispersing across the continent and seeking out the milkweed. And from again, thinking ecologically, milkweed tends to grow in disturbed areas, in open areas, which in the pre-human landscape would have been always shifting around. So it makes sense for the monarchs to be seeking all over the landscape looking for milkweed. And I know for sure that places that have had very little milkweed and people have put in gardens, there's no guarantee that the monarchs will find it the first year. And I know people that will have lots one year, not so many the next, lots again another year. So there's a randomness to it, and there are these very wide population fluctuations. 200 to 400 eggs per female with 4 or more generations per year. The chance for a population to rebound, as long as the resources are available, is there. But there are all sorts of other factors that cause these fluctuations to occur. But yeah, they'll find the milkweed sooner or later.
Mark, I had a question. This is Lisa Beer Garrett. I think you might remember me.
Of course.
And Greg Kearns had a radio tag monarch fly over Patuxent River Park. He is doing the MODIS system where he tracks ospreys and Sora rails. And he said that someplace in Pennsylvania is radio tracking monarchs. Do you know about that?
I don't. One of the pioneer companies that is miniaturizing tags, what they call life tags, is based here in Cape May, Cellular Tracking Technologies. And the 9th grade daughter of the CEO has helped us tag monarchs, and she's really trying to put the pressure on her father. I did not know of any pilot work being done yet. I know they've had some things on dragonflies.
I think it might have been at the Powder Mill Reserve. You know, maybe so, it was a sample, but that's where it tracked from, that it was from Pennsylvania when it flew over.
Yeah, that may have been pilot work. I know Mike Lanzone, who runs CTT, actually, the company was founded out in Western Pennsylvania, and they did a lot of work with the folks at Powder Mill. So they may be testing something out. Their general rule of thumb is any transmitter should be no more than 3% of the weight of the creature that's carrying it. And last I knew, they had miniaturized down to about 8 or 9%. So they were getting close. So maybe they're trying a few. Either they've got something in the technology that I hadn't heard about yet, or maybe just testing it on something that's a little beyond their normal threshold. But that's really cool to hear. For years when I've worked with these young folks, I've said, I've pointed at them and said, you're going to live to a time when we can track electronically the monarch migration. But I never thought I'd live to see that. I didn't think that technology would develop that rapidly. So that's very cool, Lisa. Thanks for sharing that. I may have to write Greg and see what else he knows about it.
Okay, thank you very much. It was good to hear you.
Yeah, come see us when the pandemic's done, Lisa.
I know. I remember the one year you had the video of Cape May of like 5,000 monarchs flying at the same time. Like in the morning, they flew up out of the plants and all went off into their migration. It was beautiful.
That was very special.
Awesome. We have 3 more questions before we finalize for tonight. So Anna says, I read that northern and southern monarchs vary in their toxicity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I've not known it to be northern versus southern, but I do know the toxicity can vary quite a bit. Part of it is the different milkweeds have different average concentrations of the cardiac glycosides. So that may be part of it. And indeed, in the south central part of the US, in Texas and places like that, there are different milkweeds. And I'm just not familiar with the numbers on that, but I know it varies. And even within one species, it can vary a little bit from plant to plant. So I know that to be true, but I do not know anything more specifically. It's probably out there. If you can't possibly read everything that gets written about monarch butterflies. It's probably second only to the mosquito in terms of how well studied it is as an insect. And the mosquito is, of course, most studied because it has such tremendously horrible impacts on human society.
Well, that is a great segue for the next question, which is, if my neighbors treat their lawns, will that keep butterflies out of my garden?
Well, it depends on what is being used. If they're airborne pesticides, then that has a potential of being a danger. I think most lawn companies are doing, if they're using pesticides, they're granular things for grubs. They're going to lose all their fireflies doing that. So I don't recommend it. But I'm not familiar with everything that gets used. But as long as it's not an aerial spray, it shouldn't have an impact on the monarchs.
And the last question of the night would be, where else can we find you? Do you have a website? Would you like to share some information on how our audience can contact you?
Sure, I do have a website. I used to have that on my final slide, but I thought that was too tacky. And my website actually collapsed a while ago, so it is now a mere shadow of what it used to be. But that's a project for COVID winter, is rebuilding all the pages on my website. If you can remember either my initials, MG, or the little English sports car, the MG, it's mgnature.com. I also have a Facebook, both a personal Facebook page, which is just under my name, or a business Facebook page, which is just MG Nature, if anyone's on Facebook. I'm on Instagram also as MG_nature, but I don't do as much on Instagram as I ought to. But those are places to find me online.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm just writing that on the chat box so people can actually have it and copy and paste. So it's mgnature.com and mgnature, sorry, in Facebook and Instagram. Oh my God, 8:21 and I can't talk anymore.
The only thing on Instagram, it's mg_nature.
Oh, okay, perfect. Let me make that correction. mg_nature on Instagram. That's what IG stands for. So thank you, everybody. You have been an amazing audience to have tonight. And I can't believe how much I learned about monarch butterflies. Thank you, Mark. This was a very special presentation. Love to have you.
Well, thanks so much. As many in this audience know, I absolutely love any opportunity to be part of Audubon Naturalist Society.
Fantastic. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.